Welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. This episode was recorded on May 14, 2026. Today on Constructive Thinking, we will have a conversation with the President and CEO of Careers Next Generation, Stefan Rutkowski. Welcome, Stefan.
Yeah, good morning. Very pleased to be here. Good morning, Paul.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, this is going to be a fantastic conversation because the body of work of Careers is one that is known to me and to, I think, our Alberta-based members, probably to a great deal. Your organization has a fair bit of, notoriety, a reputation to the credit of you and the organization. But the advantage of this conversation is to dig into these topics, not only for our Alberta-based listenership, but also because we're a national organization, we have listeners from across the country who can perhaps take away some impressions about what can be done in their own jurisdiction to reproduce the type of work that Careers is doing here. And maybe we can talk a bit about that later. But let's start at the beginning, Stefan, and maybe for our listeners, introduce yourself, maybe a little bit of a backgrounder so we can get to know you.
Yeah, very good. Thanks. It's interesting, even though I'm working for an educational foundation and nonprofit organization, that is not my background. I actually spent 22 years in industry. I was an environmental and management consultant with a large international firm, Wally Parsons. I worked internationally. I worked with international clients. I worked locally, regionally, across Western Canada. So I have a pretty good sense and pretty good understanding of what industry needs are and what drives industry. And then I swapped in 2020, so I've been with the organization about 5.5 years into this nonprofit space, using my operational and background in that space, but really looking at it from a holistic lens and saying, how can we apply now some of these learnings that I had, but also bring in other aspects in this workforce development and support industry through that.
Excellent. Well, let's start with, I think, a kind of a window opening question, which is, why does Careers exist? Well, what was the problem that was kind of discovered or realized that Careers was created to address or solve?
Yeah, it's a problem that was actually identified over 30 years ago in McMurray, and it's actually still a problem, unfortunately. But so in the early 90s, some of the oil executives up in McMurray, namely Eric Newell and Jim Carter, who was CEO and then eventually president of Syncrude, they realized that there is going to be a shortage of skilled trades laborers up in the Fort McMurray area. There were going to be a lot of baby boomers leaving the industry over the coming 10 to 20 years. And they realized we don't have enough youth coming into this. So they started thinking about what can we do and how do we align youth into these pathways. And then they started working with the Alberta Chamber of Resources as well as the school system. And they linked into the registered apprenticeship program that also started in the 90s and initially started a local co-op program that helped youth that had already graduated from university, help them go through the apprenticeship into the respective trades up in the McMurray area, but also supporting the registered apprenticeship program. And that became so popular and was taken up by industry so quickly that the organization then over the coming years spread out across the province. And eventually now we are across the province in supporting industries well beyond the energy sector where it started off originally.
Excellent. That's a good introduction. It's one thing I'll comment on. This problem that you've outlined is one that's very familiar, not just in Alberta, but across the country, this trade shortage. Anyway, how do we resolve it? One of the challenges I think that many people have seen is that the different efforts, initiatives, and even organizations that have been formed to try to tackle this question tend to be a little bit insubstantial. They have good ideas, but they don't land and they don't stick around. But you guys have been around next year for 30 years. So, Stefan, what has allowed the organization to stay relevant and to continue to grow throughout that 30 years?
Yeah, one factor most certainly was that need of bringing youth into the skilled trades. I mean, they're critical for the province here. They would be critical for the whole country. That's not unique to Alberta. So it was this alignment with a labor need that was probably not recognized well enough at the time in the education system. there probably wasn't enough support to bring youth into the trades, into the skilled trades, and careers kind of filled a little bit this gap. They help youth connect to industry, and they help youth to see the potential in these pathways. The second one was most certainly the alignment with government as well. Government understood that there was a need, developing an existing need in that space, and government has been a great supporter of the organization throughout. And the third one was the close alignment with industry as well. As I mentioned, it was started by some of the oil sands executives and their need. But we have, throughout our organizational history, we've always looked at industry as the driving force. What does industry need? Where are their gaps? What do they require in terms of their workforce development? And what are the occupations that are already having a labor shortage and or projected to have one? So it's the alignment with those. And then thirdly, that continual partnership and alignment with the education system. All our students are currently in school, except we have a program that is recently graduated youth, so they would have gone through the school system. It allows them to earn credits while they go to high school. It allows them to start their registered apprenticeship program if then the trades, so that they gain hours towards that and actually more or less finish their first year when they come out. So in the end, it was the alignment with these key stakeholders that are working in that space and finding or filling a little bit of a gap that exists in that system where they didn't naturally connect throughout the province for sure.
Interesting. And you mentioned the bulk of your participants are in school, but careers, Stefan, from what I understand, is different from the traditional education to work pathway. Can you break that down a little? Why is it different than that traditional approach of going to school and then learning a trade?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that is definitely a differentiator we're carrying. So, as you can tell from my very well curated accent, I originally come from Germany. I went through what's called a dual education system, where industry is closely aligned and involved in the education space from a much younger age, generally starting about age 16 if someone chooses a vocational path. And so we're conceptualizing this a little bit in our work as well. We're not trying to mimic the German system. That's not our goal. That's not our role. But we're, again, working with government, industry, and the school system to see where the opportunities to move some of these opportunities into that education space. So primarily, when we look at, bringing these youth into our programs or having them apply for our programs, it's with the recognition that they spend a good chunk or all of their internship, obviously, in the industry. So they're learning from industry, they have their industry mentor, they have the industry support while going to school. They're getting paid for this, which is critical for us. And that makes it somewhat unique. Some of the other programs are not necessarily paid because we believe it's important that the employer has skin in the game. They see the value of these youth that are coming in. They're not just a cheap, body that does some menial work in the background. And then the youth need to understand, well, I'm being paid for what I'm doing. So there's value to what I'm doing, and I better perform, and I'm actually better doing well rather than just showing up and treating this as a bit of a time waster. So these components are, and then that onwards. So we're an educational foundation, so it's important for us that there are what we call educational pathways following on career pathways. We don't want to just put youth into a job so that they earn some money and then they go off and do something completely different and a bit of and I put this in parentheses, waste of time. We want them to understand when they embark on this journey, there's actually an onward career pathway they have to choose to do this, whether it's in the trades, whether it's in agriculture, it's in health, etc. So they can build a career from this and build kind of a foundational experience rather than just a one-time, pop and off you go.
Well, I love the integration of recognizing on the one hand that an early commencement of trades education can and perhaps should begin as early as high school, but there's also another component, not just getting a paycheck, but that the paycheck is an emblem of the beginnings of an occupational, wage earning pathway where somebody can begin to imagine this isn't just sort of it's not like another course I'm taking that's different than book learning. It's actually, skills. It's actually a taste of what's to come. And I think that's fascinating. Stefan, you are, you're speaking to a person in the construction sector. Obviously, careers is involved in that sector, but talk to me a bit about what other industries you're focused on and why are you focused in those sectors?
Yeah, so being in Alberta energy obviously is a big sector for us. We want youth to understand the different opportunities. I mean, when you look across the trades, just as a side note, look across the trades. One of the things we're trying to instill in youth is what we consider, or what we call, the parity of esteem, right?
Yes.
These are worthwhile occupations. They're important. They're equally valuable as a university degree. And I want to make this clear, we're not against university degrees, of course, but we want to make youth understand these are equally valuable pathways. And so while we work in many industries, I mentioned energy, you said construction, manufacturing, obviously we have the trades in agriculture, it pretty much straddles all industries or sectors in this province. The key message that we're trying to convey to youth is start somewhere. Right? This is your opportunity to start somewhere. You will find as we talked about, you will find your pathway. It might be in construction. It might be elsewhere. What is very, very important is that employers see the opportunity bringing these youth in at that time to show them what a great career they can build in that respective industry. Right? So it's less so important where they start. It's actually the opportunity lies with the employer or the industry to show them what that can do for them.
Fantastic. I love the reference to parity of esteem. You and I have met separately, and I share with you the fact that I went on a fact-finding mission with then Minister of HRSDC, Jason Kenney, with a whole group of industry folks, and we learned kind of for the first time, I think, as a Canadian contingent, about this parity of esteem concept and how the German people have kind of, well, no, I'm not sure if they broke it, but I think that they addressed an element that we have not allowed to come into frame in Canada, which is this disparity, this stigma that's attached vis-a-vis a university education and vocational or occupational pathway, and that of a trades pathway. Whereas in Germany, all these occupations are held equally of value to the German people, and that's such a game changer in terms of opening doors for parents with kids in school and the kids themselves who begin to imagine what their future life might look like. So credit to you for that. I'm aware, Stefan, that you facilitated over 5,600 internships last year. Talk a bit about the kind of impact that has on youth and the employers that they're working with.
So one of the challenges that we have seen, and that's been well recognized, is that disconnect somewhat of the learning that some youth have in Canada, both in the K-12 as well in post-secondary, and the needs and the requirements of employers when they come out of school. So their skills don't always match what employers are looking for. Yeah. So the more we can tie youth into that industry space, and we call it the workplace as an extension of the classroom, that active learning, you touched on this earlier, where they can understand and see what the employer needs, what kind of where their focus is when you actually work, and what they're looking for. They're looking at slightly different things than what you would learn in school on a day-to-day basis. They're looking at teamwork, they're looking at collaboration, they're looking at your communication abilities, they're looking at how you handle crisis situations, or crisis probably too strong, but situations where you have to make decisions. That's what an employer is interested in to see. This is what these youth learn when they take these internships on, some of them for the first time in their life. And they get this experience while at the same time the employer realizing, okay, this is how the current generation that comes into the workforce acts. They act differently than what, maybe I probably acted 40 or so years ago when I started. So it gives them the opportunity to align a little bit their systems, their processes to this, and understand better when they actually hire them of what their drivers are. So it's a little bit, the opportunity for youth is obviously experiences, but for employers is really to align themselves to some extent without changing what they do, if what these youth will need. And that goes down to retention and all these other things that obviously factor into this equation as well. So it's an alignment piece that is important. And that skills match that I talked about is actually critical and huge. If you are 24 years old and you worked very little to not at all, but you have great education, you have very different expectations of coming out. You would say, well, I went to school for 16 years. I did 12 years of K-12, probably some preschool even, and now I did 4 years of post-secondary. I want a good, well-paid job because I have all this experience. And an employer looks at you and saying, you never worked a day in your life. So let me start you off at a junior position, right, an entry position now. And you said, I don't want to do this. This is not really what I went to school for. And I understand these don't match. So the more we can provide this experience as early as possible, help the pathway development, but also the experience, it bridges this gap in the end and helps youth move into the workforce faster and more easily.
Fantastic. Let's switch things up. For the past little while, we've been talking about the purpose and the model, the impact of the careers organization. Let's switch a little bit to the actual challenge that we're trying to address that you began with, which is the youth employment challenge. We're here in Alberta, and it is not just Alberta, BC, Ontario, but other jurisdictions. But let's talk about the idea that Alberta is often seen as the land of opportunity. With this robust energy sector with so much promise. Why are we still, given all these energy and construction-related jobs, why are we still seeing this persistent high youth unemployment rate in Alberta, Stefan?
Well, it is certainly a factor of a combination of a number of different factors. The one that we kind of fit in is what I just discussed a little bit, that skills mismatch.
Yeah.
The other piece, though, is that there is a belief, and it comes back to what you touched on earlier, Paul. There's this belief that once you've finished school, you'll find it, but just do your school first, your post-secondary. Do this first and then figure out what you're going to do. You might be doing a degree that is leading to something, but don't worry so much about what it's going to be. Just do your job. And that leads you to, however old you're, 23, 24 years old, or somewhere around this when you're leaving school. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these youth probably won't work while they are, even when they have the opportunity to throughout that educational period. So that's a huge contributor to this youth unemployment. The other one is that we're seeing, and this is a technology change, of course, over the last several years. There's more and more automation. There's more and more AI applications. So these entry-level jobs are somewhat disappearing. There's less of them in totality. We're seeing this rising more and more from an impact perspective. So the question then is, again, how do youth get that first experience, get their foot into the door if these positions are disappearing, which comes back to the work we're doing. We're helping, you mentioned it, 5,600 youth to get this first experience. I can assure you that a good number of these youth will not end up in the occupation that they did the internship in. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with this. The point being, though, is that all of them at some point in time can turn around and say, I did this. I have that experience. I understand this way better now. And I did my entry kind of level job at some point in time. And then there's as I said, the other factors, we don't have a lot of leverage. There's obviously economic factors that play in right now. I don't want to use this as a technical term, but Alberta is more of a gig economy, right? You get hired when there's projects, when they're hot. Yeah. You get hired if they recede. People are being laid off. In an economy that's a little bit more shaky, youth are generally the last to be hired, the first to go and the last to be hired. But that's not my area of expertise, but we understand that this obviously is contributing to these numbers. Interesting.
I'm probably not the only person who's had this kind of conversation with my peers, with people in this industry, but sometimes, particularly the older of us, harken back to an earlier time in our lives, in our country, when we all started working early and we work hard, and it seems like today's youth just don't have a lot of motivation. They just don't really want to do this. I think that what you're talking about is not hinging so much on motivation, Stefan. What's actually driving the disconnect that we're trying to tackle here?
Yeah, if I may, I'm going to touch on this for a second, because we do a lot of surveys and getting feedback from both employers and youth. And the feedback we generally get back is definitely not that youth are not motivated or not engaged or not interested. It's actually the reverse. When you get youth in, they're actually highly motivated. They want to learn and they're interested in what they're doing. As a matter of fact, youth that are coming in right now, the current generation is actually very interested in what they're doing. They want to understand the value, right? Why am I doing this work? So they're more inquisitive, and that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with this. They're very inquisitive to understand what value they're providing and what value the organization provides. What they do lack, and comes back to what I said earlier, what we hear consistently back is that they don't have that foundational experience, that foundational kind of skills that you and I would have probably gained when we started earlier, working in a team, working in an organization, understanding how an organization works and all of that. So it is really this disconnect of that early engagement and the expectation that an employer has versus the expectation that a youth has when they enter the workforce, which is really driving this. They're actually also highly regarded for their technology knowledge. Youth that are entering right now for their entire life grew up with technology. My two sons, they're in their mid-20s now. They don't know a world without an iPhone or a mobile device. That's their world, and it's natural for them to apply this in the workspace, in the workplace, as well as in any other setting. So they actually, employers generally recognize that knowledge and that ease of technology application or usage as a positive to them. They actually learn from that to some extent within the constraints of an internship. So there's a lot of positives that youth bring. But the challenge is that skills piece, that they don't have these foundational employability skills that they're lacking.
Interesting. Here's another question. There's often a kind of a perspective or a narrative that education is the solution to all of our issues. More education, better education. And I don't think you or I would disagree that we need a healthy and vibrant and productive education system. But why, Stefan, would you say, or could we say, that education alone is not enough?
Yeah, it probably would depend on the definition of education.
Yeah.
If it's just classroom learning, yes, that's probably going to be overly limited for a good number of youth. If you extend learning, what I mentioned earlier, to the where you say, well, the workplace, there's actually active learning happening outside of the school as well, then education, and for that matter, industry, has a large role to play in that education system, where they can actually extend this to what is more natural to some of these youth. And I think there's some work certainly done in the education system to adjust to this more and more. There's way more opportunities for youth right now to take these off-campus, what are called off-campus programs, to do internships or other off-campus experiences, to get engaged with what's called dual credit, where you earn some of your credits during high school that also give you credit for the post-secondary level. So that leads you more straight into that. It's still based on some level of classroom learning, but there's some active learning in these post-secondary institutions. So there's a lot of collegiates that are being stood up in the province, which are way more focused on that pathway development. So a lot of things are happening in this space. And if we now can strengthen that connection again to industry, where they realize, oh, we are an active partner in this. We are actually educating these youth as well by bringing them in. There's an educational component to this, not just the work component. We're mentoring them. We're leading them into this. We're helping them to understand what it means. That overlap that happens in these other systems, which we talked about Germany, that's going to be, for me, the biggest win in that education system. But it's not driven necessarily only by the education system. It's that that collaboration almost between industry, and not to make industry responsible. I'll make this very clear. I'm not sitting here saying, hey, industry, tack you it now to educate our kids. Yeah. But there is a difference between that academic learning, and you probably know this. Canada has, amongst the most developed countries, the G7, the highest percentage of post-secondary, so college or university graduates in all of these countries, 60-odd%. It's the highest. So academically, this country is well ahead of many others. Comes back to that, is that matching the skills that we need in this country currently for some of these major projects, or the projects that are, the nation-building projects, all of that, are these graduates matching these skills? And in some cases, they don't. So it's not a comment about, oh, don't get academically educated. It's a question about what is going to help you as a youth to get into not only employment, but at a career pathway that will build a long-term career for you that can span way beyond what you initially started.
Just before we move on to the next section, an observation from me, and I invite you to kind of respond or pivot off of it. I remember on that trip to Germany, one of the points that was made in one of the roundtables we went to is that many of the German engineers began their careers in a trade. Not necessarily all of them, but that seemed to be a bit of a point to make. And it's fascinating to me that in a couple of ways. One of them is that because of the German dual education system, these young individuals prior to becoming engineers were learning physics and mathematics and probably chemistry and things like that, not in the abstract, but in the context of a parallel or connected body of work in a trade where those concepts were applied. And so the applied nature of what for many students just seems completely, outside of reality. That doesn't make any sense to them. And then I think the other side of that coin that the student begins to realize is that this mathematics that I'm learning is not only helping me in doing my measurements as a kind of an apprentice carpenter, but it's going to actually turn into the basis of my career. So there's something really fascinating about unpacking all the different facets of having an internship while in high school, that it's not just an opportunity, as we talked about earlier, to make some money and maybe turn into a job, but it actually creates an unbelievable synergy with the book learning that you're doing and the different topics that you're doing in high school.
100%. And this is the beauty of the system in this case. You spend 80% of your time in industry, 20% in school. You go through a vocational track, you spend 20% at a vocational school, where you get you still get some general educational learning. So you still have math and your social sciences and language arts and whatnot at a lower level.
Yeah.
And then the rest is technical training in that school. But 80% is really with industry. And this comes back to what you said. You have there's this natural bridging between these two. You learn what industry needs, you learn what they need. But you apply all of this, or the learning that you do in school is directly applied in your day-to-day work, because you go back to your employer the next day. We have this, some of this has been developed here and is happening here as well. What we see is youth that maybe at grade 8, 9, or 10 start thinking, but I should just leave school. This is not for me. I don't know what I'm doing here in math. I don't know why this physics is important. Yeah. Once they start, particularly when they start the registered apprenticeship program, if they choose to do so, and let's say an electrician, well, you need to know a lot of physics and math when you're an electrician. And you suddenly you realize when you're in these internships or you're with your employer, you realize, oh my God, how I get it. This makes sense. This is why electrons flow. This is why X, Y, Z, exactly. Whatever that is. Yeah. And we have seen, and I don't have recent numbers, so this is more anecdotal than hard data. It has significantly improved youth staying in school. So it was actually partially also started off as a stay in school program, because you saw more and more youth leaving school with no real prospect in that McMurray area at the time. They think, well, what's the point? I'm just going to leave. But seeing that direct application of their learning in the workplace, particularly in the science-based, so in the STEM area, was a significant game changer. And that's still the case. We still see this, that you see that application and see this as a benefit and improves generally, it improves their learning outcomes in school.
Excellent. Let's switch to another topical area. We broached this a little bit when we talked about Alberta as a land of opportunity, but we're facing in this province, as do other provinces, significant labor shortages in key sectors. Stefan, how does youth unemployment exist alongside that reality? So we have a need, and we have a solution. How do you match those two?
I don't know. It's a puzzle to me. Every day I get up and see the youth unemployment rate. It's a puzzle to me. Because you're so right. It is unimaginable that we have that youth unemployment at about last month or so. It was about 14% roughly. So it has come down from almost 20% last year in the fall roughly, which is huge. Every fifth youth at the time was unemployed. But at the same time, we have this have this skilled labor shortage. And a lot of work is being done by government, industry, most any stakeholder in that space. As you might know, the Alberta Youth Employment Incentive was started last year in the fall by the Ministry of Jobs, Economy, Trade and Immigration to incentivize employers to actually hire youth. The economy has some challenges right now. We know this. And as I mentioned before, most times youth are the first one to go and the last one to be hired into industry. And we're facing this right now. So incentivizing is certainly helping, but it also needs industry to start looking at youth as part of their workforce development plan. I would argue, and that probably can be counted by a lot of folks, the times when we were able to rely on folks coming out from Newfoundland or elsewhere, they're probably over to that extent we had in the past. So then next question is, okay, are we bringing in temporary foreign workers to do this?
Yes.
Well, we know that this is a challenge now as well, and probably not the solution to it. There's migration within Canada, which will solve some of it, but other provinces are facing the same, so that's probably limited. And now you suddenly have a huge population, i.e. in this case being youth, sitting there, somewhat ready, somewhat idle, but not really having looked at as that, 10 years back when I was still in industry, I never heard someone talking about youth. I heard about temporary foreign workers, and I did hear about folks coming out from out east. And now we have these. So I think there needs to be a rethinking in industry to say, okay, well, how do we do this? Yeah. We have partially a solution to this, of course, but how do we bring folks into this and build our workforce that we don't have to rely solely on these other sources? They will always be part of the mix. I'm not denying that. But there is an opportunity to really, flick that switch and saying, okay, well, let's focus on this as an opportunity. Germany has an unemployment. We keep coming back to Germany, but this is what I know most about. We have an unemployment rate about 7% for youth. A youth unemployment of 7.1%, which is not that much higher than regular unemployment. Sure. So very close. So and similar when we look at here, I think 6.0%, 6.5 or so was Alberta's unemployment rate versus the roughly 14%. So people will find work. We're not having an unemployment issue necessarily. These youth will find work. It's just really delayed until they get to this point. So how do we move this all forward? And it's a huge economic benefit from this. If you think about that, a 21-year-old or 20 or 21-year-old is in employment. Economically, that's a huge benefit to the province and the economy. So if you move this earlier by integration of industry, by including youth into that workforce planning, it's a win-win-win for everybody.
Well, you said it so well, and I want to talk a little bit about the role of the employer in a capacity more than just providing a job, because I think that's obviously the concrete end of this. But the employer needs to have a bit of a broader vision. And I think what you just kind of covered is interesting. That we talked about the fact that perhaps the East Coast is not as robust as an opportunity as it once was for a bunch of reasons. The TFW program is kind of under some pressure. And then there are a number of admittedly fantastic initiatives and programs in respect to training and working with Indigenous peoples, women building futures, the children of immigrants. But that's the key, is that all those cohorts, Indigenous people, women, children of immigrants, the one common denominator is their kids are in school. So if we can kind of tackle this, it's not I don't think we can make it that simple, but the internship program, the dual education program, even if you talk to, for example, Bill Black at the Calgary Construction Association, their focus on providing very basic initial awareness of skills training in grades 1 to 6. That's a whole other thing you and I could go down, but we'll save that. But let's talk, Stefan, about the role of the employer, because the employer has this kind of terrible dilemma where they, as you mentioned, it's kind of gig-ish, where the employer does not usually, unless it's a maintenance project, have a continuous steady state flow of work. They have to get 500 people for a year, and then it's down to 250, then it's up to 750. And so they have to kind of rise and fall. And so employers kind of understand intuitively that they have to do some work to build that workforce of tomorrow. But often that workforce of today or next week is one that they need to get their hands on via more immediate solutions. So how do employers become those visionaries? How do they help shape the future workforce, Stefan?
If I could answer this, perfectly, we probably wouldn't need to have this podcast. But so one of where we see some successes is where a larger, let's say a general contractor, a large organization becomes the model and looks at their contractors, subs, to mimic what they do. So it becomes a bit of a broad, it's not one organization doing it and the rest is kind of wallowing along and saying that's fine. where we see some successes there, where there's an active engagement of generally a large organization, general contractor, saying, this is what we do, this is what important to us, and this is important to us, and we would want in our ecosystem folks to mimic this and do the same. So it is a bit of an organic spread from that. That doesn't necessarily answer what we understand. I understand this. I'm not saying that any contractor or any organization should take on youth for the sake of it, even if the economy or their work is going down just yet. I get all of that. But we have to get to a point where youth don't feel that they're building a career on a very shaky ground. And if you're a first-year apprentice and you're being let go after 3 months and you can't find this next employer, and you're sitting there idle for 2 or 3 months until you find the next one, but by now, it's going to take you a year and a half or more to get your first year hours in to write your first year exam, everything starts getting delayed more and more and more and more. So and naturally, of course, if more employers start understanding that even for a short period of time, so again, I'm not talking about necessarily a full-time employment right away, but to say, I commit to taking on more, particularly first years or second years, when we look at the trades, I'm going to take them on because I know it's going to help my industry. They're going to come out faster. And from a cultural perspective, not to only look at it saying, this is going to be my next employer.
Yes.
My employee, but to say this is going to be one resource we can eventually draw on, even though they may end up elsewhere at some point in time. So it's almost a circular kind of economy piece in this. So it's a bit of a broader thinking. I know this is financially challenging. I get it.
Yeah.
But I think we still look very often as your first year as a cheap labor that you bring on or off when you don't need them anymore. And I'm generalizing. Of course, this is not for every organization. And then we kind of let them off and then, okay, well, you figure out what you're going to do next. We can't, this province has done so great. We have 75,000 apprentices, over 78,000, close to 80,000 apprenticeships, which is awesome. But it doesn't help us if you have in some trades, a 50% attrition rate.
Yeah.
That, it becomes almost meaningless. Yeah. And I'm not saying it is meaningless. Again, the post-secondaries and Alberta advanced education have done extremely well in this space. But industry now needs to kind of understand this, right? Now, how do we support these folks through that they stay in there? And then this labor shortage, all of this becomes less of an issue if these things starts lining up.
Quite so. Let's move into the final kind of category, which I think it would be, the lines of policies and solutions. Just a moment ago, you referred to the financial challenge of an employer who is trying to have that broader perspective and think a bit ahead and make an investment, not necessarily for itself, but for the industry, knowing hopefully that the industry benefiting will come back to help the company. There are incentive programs in place to help out. There's the Alberta Youth Employment Incentive. Stefan, how does that help reduce barriers for employers?
Yeah, so the incentive program, which Korea's actually developed together with the Ministry, Jobs, Economy, Trade, Immigration last year, was meant to actually address some of the things I mentioned earlier. A lot of it was actually related to how do we help youth gain these employability skills and connect them to industry up to age 24, up to age 25. What it does, it pays about, if you take minimum wage, the employer ends up paying about $10, it pays about $10 on the hour for youth that they bring them in. And depending on the level, there's different levels, all the way from $7,000 down to $4,000. And you have to bring in youth for a certain amount of hours, as well as the number of youth. It's all dependent on these different categories. But what it really does, it very effectively breaks down this key barrier, financial, obviously for the employer. Why would I bring on this youth? They're going to cost me almost as much as a full-time employee. I'm taking on some level of risk because I never worked with them. Well, now if I pay a fraction of my wage, well, this is going to help. And I'm going to carry them on for a minimum number of hours, which is a requirement under this incentive program. And then it's a little bit incumbent on both the employee and the employer to see, well, is this a natural fit going forward, right? Yeah. This youth is performing well. This is going to be a win for me. So it's a bit of a trial run for some of them, and some of them are hired straight out, which is obviously, that's the best outcome. So it is really meant to take one of these barriers away and at the same time provide these youth breaking down their barrier that they have when it comes to this employability skill. So it works actually on two fronts at the same time and addresses these two needs in a very innovative way, I would say anyways. So, and we've seen that the program has been extended by another half year because we got a huge response by industry, huge uptake and huge interest. And I think we're well over, I think by now we have placed, I don't know the exact number, probably about 12 or 1,300 youth within this program within a fairly short period of time. And I think close to 1,000 employers. No, actually we placed way more youth. But anyway, huge numbers have come through. So it shows again, there is an interest and need by industry to bring these folks on. Because I don't bring them on just to sit on the sideline. They're actually working. So there's an interest and need. Yeah. And now it's a question of breaking down these initial entry barriers. And that's what this incentive does.
Interesting. I will say, partly, in respect to my own organization, Progressive Contractors, who have contractors across the country, that I think one of the positive developments in various provinces, but also recently with the spring economic statement from the federal government, the Canada, I think it's called Team Canada Strong, with some very notable incentives. I'll say, if I can, Stefan, here to the listeners, if any listener needs to learn more about the full suite of different incentive programs that exist provincially and federally, it can be a bit difficult to navigate because there are numerous of them. So that's a good thing. But if you need any help navigationally, please contact me. I'd be happy to provide assistance. On the other hand, Stefan, incentives are not automatically a solution, are they? They're more of a kind of a lever or like a force amplifier. Talk a little bit about what needs to exist alongside of incentives to really get some good impact going.
100%. I think this is a short-term solution. Yeah. to counter somewhat some of the challenges you spoke about. It's not a long-term, we can't have the next 10, 20, 30 years providing incentives to employers to take on youth. That's not realistic, nor is it desirable by anybody. I think what is happening under the Canada approach, right, the national approach, is to provide still some incentive to employers. So the similar model, I think, is being applied there as well. But I think eventually there needs to be some level of incentive. I'm not saying it's monetary incentive. There could be other incentives. And I'm not an economist, nor I'm a policy advisor or any of these things. But there needs to be some level of incentive why I would want to bring a youth in. And it can be manifold, I'm sure. And someone much smarter than me will come up with something that's more systemic rather than just monetary based. And the other thing is, and I keep harping on this, but will have to be that cultural and that more broad understanding that youth is part of the workforce, not just in education and they're learning to eventually be employed. They are part of the workforce. And the earlier we connect them, then these incentives eventually can go away from a pure monetary aspect. And the earlier we can get these youth connected, but also the earlier we can have employers understand what their next potential workforce is, rather than waiting for them to emerge somehow magically, it's not going to suddenly, our system will never, I don't think, in the foreseeable future, get to a youth unemployment rate of 5, 6, 7%. That's not going to happen. But take 3, 4, 5% out of this, closer to a higher single, it's you. It would be massive. And I don't believe that's unachievable. I think it's achievable, actually. And so coming back to kind of what you ask is, the incentive is a short-term solution to show the impact that it can have. The long-term goal needs to be that industry sees themselves as a partner in education and a critical part of the education system. And that's why I use the word partner. They are not the education system, but they're a critical partner in that education system.
So important. Let's begin to wind down here. This has been a completely fascinating conversation, but given some time constraints, I want to ask you 2 more questions. One of them is quite close to my heart. I wrote a blog actually about this, the kind of the dismantling of our shop classes in Canada over the past number of decades. But on the other hand, in certain jurisdictions, I think Alberta is actually a leader in this, is that there has been an emphasis placed on trying to rejuvenate the collegiate, what we call the vocational school, the collegiate school system. Well, it certainly is not to the point that it used to be, but it is rising in our province. And I understand, Stefan, that careers partners with many of these collegiates. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I think that's fascinating as well. It took me a while to figure out the difference between your program and what a collegiate might offer. And they're not either or. It's a kind of a both and, or it's kind of a partner thing, as you just referenced.
Yeah, it is this is a perfect partnership. It's beautiful, actually. The beauty of a collegiate is that because generally, in most cases, particularly when we talk skilled trades, there's a connection to a post-secondary. So take the Central Alberta Collegiate Institute, which partners with Reddy Polytech as well as Olds College, where they actually provide the shop facilities in a way, the welding shops and whatnot for the collegiate youth. So they're going to spend some of their time actually at the collegiate or at the college and or the Polytech to do some of their work, their technical learning. That's huge. Most schools won't be able to finance this on their own, having these shops. That's not realistic. Plus, it provides this ongoing you stay ahead of technology all the time. Polytechs are way better in keeping up with technology than individual schools can. So that's a huge win. Now, you pair this group of very, very obviously interested, well-trained, they're on a path students with careers in this case, where we come in and say, we're going to take all these kids and we're going to place them actually in industry and give them the experience now in industry, besides the experience that they get in their post-secondary as well as their secondary education there. You get kids coming out of these collegiates, which are so highly desirable from a workforce perspective, very well trained. So it's actually a perfect. We're not taking away from this. We're not stealing someone out of this. We're actually providing the collegiates the opportunity to focus on what they do best, which is education, and provide that technical training, and we connect that industry piece to it, and do it in kind of a triangle between post-secondary, secondary, and careers in this case.
I love it. It's fantastic. Listen, last question, Stefan. If you could change one thing about how Alberta connects youth to work tomorrow or the next day, what would it be? What would be the one thing you'd do?
I doubt Minister Nicolaitis, the Minister of Education, is listening, and I'm going to say this with great respect because he's done a lot of work in this space. If we could get to a point where we actually require every youth going towards their high school degree to do an off-campus program, so an internship experience as we provide as part of their credit requirements, I think we would have taken a huge step forward, where this doesn't become just kind of a choice. I'll do this because I need some credits. I'll do it because I want to do some work. We're saying we think this is important. You ought to do this to show that you actually have that work experience or that foundational learning. That would be a huge step from a mandatory perspective. Is it realistic? Again, Minister Nicolaitis, if you listen, I'm not telling you what to do, but I think this would be a huge step forward.
Well, Stefan, please consider myself, but more broadly, the Progressive Contractors Association as highly motivated and interested, and whatever we can do, following this phone call with you and your team to support you, count us as actively interested and available. Stefan Rutkowski from the Careers Next Generation. Thank you for your time. Stefan, if people want to reach you to learn more, what's the best way to do that?
The best way is probably, website. Well, they can always contact me, but surely people won't write down my email address or so. But on our website, we have a contact us form. It's careersnextgen.ca. So careersnextgen.ca is one word, Careers Next Gen. And we actually committed to, and we generally follow up within 24 hours. So anyone who contacts us, we have a team that does nothing else than following leads, because we get a lot of youth and parents and industry, for that matter, contacting us. So that's one of the ways. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, Stefan Rutkowski. I'm on LinkedIn. Be super happy to connect with anyone who will listen to this and wants more information.
Stefan, thank you for your time today. All the best to you.
Oh, thanks for having me. This was very enjoyable, actually, Paul.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent or the program host.